Welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. I'm the editor-in-chief and publisher of Broken Lens Journal, Adam Stutz.
And I'm Heather Watson. I'm the managing editor and the creative director.
How are you doing?
Doing well. How about you?
I'm on defrost.
What does that mean?
Defrost is a term that my sister used to use for my nieces when they were really little to describe the state that they were in after they woke up from a really long nap. So it's that moment, like when a little kid wakes up and they kind of like cling to their parent. And if there's other people around, they don't want to have anything to do with you. That's basically like so
That's where you are right now.
yeah, so I'm just on
At 9
defrost.
o'clock on a Wednesday.
Yeah, exactly. So
Happy to hear it.
I think I kind of operate on like a defrost baseline. So really I could be in a state of defrost at virtually any time of day.
That makes sense. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
because of my perpetual sleep deprivation. So
Yeah, so why are you so sleep deprived? It's almost like you had a big event last night.
we may have had a big event where we had a reading that happened at Stories, Books, and Cafe up in Echo Park. It was last night, and it was awesome.
It was. It really was.
It was a really great reading. We had 6 readers, Theo Morans and Yasmin Archer, who we published in our most recent issue, and Tori Gesualdo, Lucy Murray, Claire Schwartz, and Josh Charles. And it was great. It was well attended, and we just had a really, really fun time, and we were out for a while. So
No, but as somebody who, I have not been to many poetry readings, and it was really enjoyable. It was really cool to see, just the difference between words on a page and then the actual, essentially, performance of people's work. It's really, it's
yeah,
amazing. It really
yeah,
brings a different character to writing.
yeah. And I love when you're able to actually hear the person's work in their own voice.
Hmm.
When you're reading poetry, and it's a solitary experience, but when you actually get to see it unfold in real time and be able to hear it, like the tone and the certain mannerisms and other, even just the extraneous conversation and exposition that happens in and around
Hmm.
the poems, and engagement with the audience, it's pretty cool. It's a great experience, and I think, if anything, the most important part of it is the community building.
Hmm.
And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I loved the opportunity to meet new people. We had a number of people come up after the reading asking about submissions and collaborating. It was a cool event. It was really fun. Hopefully, we'll have opportunities to do more readings associated with the journal in the future. And, for anyone that's listening who hasn't been to Stories, Books, and Cafe in Echo Park, definitely check it out. It's one of
Yeah,
my
it's a cool
favorite
place.
bookstores. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see how somebody would end up spending a lot of money there, though.
Thanks.
That
Are
really
you
wasn't meant
outing
to be a
me?
jab at you. I promise. It just, in general, it really does. I could see how one could quickly become a kid in a candy shop. Not just you, Adam. Not just you.
You're also not incorrect in that I've probably spent substantial sums of money purchasing books at their store. They're a wonderful bookstore, and they are I would say a very big, like, important focal point for the neighborhood, and a wonderful institution. Definitely worth checking out if coming in from out of town, or even if you live in Los Angeles and you've never been before. Stories is definitely worth checking out. Our guests today, we have Elizabeth Deanna Morris Lakes and Lennart Lundh. I had a wonderful conversation with Liz. She and I talked about a wide variety of topics, and I really enjoy her work in particular. Rutabagas is a great poem for anyone that would like to go, check it out. Head to our website, brokenlensjournal.com. I like that we got into discussion kind of in and around like ecopoetics. We use a lot of puns, and I'll use another one that a lot of her work is rooted in uh, in the ground and in the earth and in nature, but it goes beyond that, and I think she really does a wonderful job of being able to tackle very large themes in terms of loss of love, death, and subjects that are also being addressed and discussed by other contributors to the journal.
I mean, with her work, I felt very tied to it, or like it was much more tangible to me because of the imagery that she used.
Mhm.
Just because I really enjoy gardening and just nature and plants and stuff like that. So the terminology that she used struck a chord with me. And
Mhm.
then obviously seeing the double meaning or the metaphors being used in her writing
Mhm.
was really interesting.
Yeah. She just has this encyclopedic knowledge of plants and plant names, and I was really impressed. And I think a lot of the way she infuses that knowledge into how she writes, and it kind of creates a new musicality. It's really really cool. And we just talked about a wide variety of things. We talked about making ourselves vulnerable to other artists by sharing our work with people. I'm assuming you probably got a kick out of her love for Ben Schwartz.
Yes. And I was
Uh,
impressed that you remembered that I like him so much.
yes. I had to point that out during the course of the interview. She is a diehard Ben Schwartz fan.
He's hilarious. How could you not be?
He is really funny. My other interviewee is Lennart Lundh. I really enjoyed my conversation with Leonard. I think he is a man of many mediums. He's a historian, he's a poet, he is a photographer, he is also a Vietnam veteran, and we had a very wide-ranging and I think heartfelt conversation about how all of those things tie together. And you can check out Leonard's photographs in issue 3 of Broken Lens Journal. And we just talked about kind of like how he is both a documentary photographer with his experience rooted in journalism, but he's reticent to call himself a fine art photographer, but he does like to do, I guess, what would be considered more like fine art photography, which is some of the work that we've featured. We were talking about how the photographs that we've published are effectively telling a story, and comparing that to his own experience writing and how the two different mediums intersect. He's a really great guy. One of the things that I was very moved by was the fact that he creates these chapbooks that he sells, but all the proceeds go to a cancer organization. And and we'll provide a link in show notes to the organization so folks can seek out copies of our authors' books, and as well as organizations that are important to them. But I just thought it was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I really loved his work. He has a really strong skill in finding just the beauty in the ordinary, the
Hmm.
everyday, that kind of thing. And
Hmm.
it's a good reminder to stop and find significance in everything that is around you, that kind of thing. So I appreciated one, his work on its own, but then listening to him talk about it, like
Yeah.
how he came across these things, how he found significance in them, that kind of thing. And just the skill in capturing that is pretty impactful.
I love all the photographs, but I'd say that my favorite is the one that's of all the tops of the soap dispensers,
Hmm.
just because of the texture, the light, and I don't know. I just love the arrangement of
Yeah.
them, and the fact that he caught that just when he was walking through IKEA.
That's what I mean. It's just like
Yeah,
it's just all around us.
yeah.
It's just a matter of what you're looking for, what you're,
Hmm.
the perspective that you choose to take on what's around you.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear about that process. He talks about the fact that, the DSLR like gives him the ability to be able to, shoot thousands of photos at once, and how that makes it easier for him to kind of fire off of, like a number of photos in a setting. And if we think back to the interview that we did with Richard Hayden, he talked about, the fact that when he has to, he shoots like his Polaroids and he's doing his Polaroid project, he has to be much more deliberate, like with how he shoots. And that, was also something that I could relate to Leonard's description of how he used to have to shoot, like when he was shooting film. And so it's just great to like hear about how people's processes evolve, and how those processes shape decision making, like that, as they go through and shoot these photographs. And I think there's a lot of connection to how people compose poems
Mhm.
and writing and making those decisions and how to be very deliberate in what they do. All right. Here are my interviews with Elizabeth Deanna Morris Lakes and Lennart Lundh. Elizabeth Deanna Morris Lakes, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast.
Hi, it's so nice to be with you today.
Thank you so much for joining us. I was wondering if we could start by having you read Rutabagas.
Yeah, I would love to. Rutabagas. The first frost snapped summer shut. I know to let a few frosts kiss the rutabagas to make them sweeter, but could I have collected the leaves last night before the shards of ice crystals sliced through their cell walls, leaving them limp on the ground? You always knew about the brassica, how and when to harvest these plants that thrive in cool weather limbo, the place between winter and deep freeze. This year, the harvest feels like gathering the dead. Pickling feels like embalming. I collect the dollars from the honesty box at the end of the driveway. The rain has come. The tomatoes are already ruined, swollen with water, their sides split open to find rot.
It's a beautiful poem.
Oh, thank you.
When you had submitted to us, I was really struck by this work. And one of my favorite parts of the poem is the juxtaposition of pickling feels like embalming, and I collect the dollars from the honesty box at the end of the driveway. I love those two images, and the poem does wrestle with mortality, but I think there's also a vibrance to the work and how you capture just the environment that you're working in. And by that I mean as you're harvesting crops from a garden, I'm assuming. And what I've noticed is that rutabagas and much of your other recent work is rooted, and this pun intended, um, in the earth, gardening, harvesting crops. Can you talk about how that factors into your work, how the earth, gardening, the body, all those things play a role in your writing?
Yeah, so my second book that I'm trying to get published right now is called Brassica. And specifically, I'm looking at the Brassica oleracea plant, which is the parent plant to a lot of cultivars that you're very familiar with. So Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, cabbages, kale, turnips. Well, no, not turnips. Turnips are a different brassica. And when you put Brassica oleracea and Brassica, I think it's nigra, together, you get rutabagas, which is a third brassica. There's 6 brassica. We don't have to talk about all of them. But I had started writing these poems right after when I finished grad school. My thesis was like pretty dark. And my thesis ended up being my first book, Ashley Sugarnutch and the Wolf, which is about toxic masculinity and cycles of violence and fate. And it's based sort of in like a folk tale sort of setting. And it was like just so depressing. And I had spent the second half of that year really working on the second half of that book, which ended up only being like a few poems at the end, like a little coda. And I was really just thinking about like what it means to be human. I had originally wanted to call the book A Human Like the Rest of Us. And I was really thinking about like, what do we do with bad guys? Like, do we just throw them to the, like, do we just expect them to like off themselves? Like if we find somebody who's a bad guy, what is redemption? And what are we supposed to do with that? And so I was very tired of this. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to write a bunch of really sexy vegetable poems because I really like vegetables. And the first one I wrote was called Artichoke, which got published in Gigantic Sequins, which I'm really proud of. And I just started writing all these really sexy poems about these 2 women that lived together on a farm and were trying to sort of build a life together. And instead, they ended up being about every woman that's ever betrayed me. So I am I am an adult lady, and I am pansexual, and I am married to a red-bearded person like yourself, to my husband Kenny. But I am pansexual, and I have had a lot of women in my life that I have, had varying levels of intimacy with. And many of them have betrayed me. And so I started writing these poems, and I was thinking a lot about, I think you're right in terms of like thinking about the earth and the body. I started thinking about this concept that I've decided to call, and this, I don't know if this exists otherwise. So when I say this term, please know that if this exists already, I'm not referencing anything else that's referencing. I've been calling it the wild domestic. The idea that you can have this sort of very curated space like a farm or a garden, and it's obviously very tended to, so like you are pruning, your things are in rows, things are in flower beds, but there's only so much you can do to really control that environment because it's still wild. So there's still, plants are still going to grow however they want to grow. Birds are still going to come and eat your strawberries. And I think that relationships very oftentimes are sort of the wild domestic. And that's what happens in the center of the book, which is that, and this poem is from the second half of the book, the sad half, the less sexy half, where the you character in the book just leaves one day. And I sort of also, as a note, see this as a continuation of Ashley Sugarnotch and the Wolf, though it's like not at all thematically or with characters or anything like that. But I felt like the sort of unanswered question was like, what do we do with forgiveness? And who is forgiveness for? And so this book ends up being in these two halves, where the first half is about them being in love and trying to grow these things and trying to know what it means to live in a world where you're trying to make things grow. And then the second half is about the speaker grappling with, what does it mean for me to forgive this person that abandoned me if I'm never going to speak to that person again, and if I don't even know where they are? And what does it mean to then be left with this wild domestic space where I now have to make decisions about what I'm going to let grow or not grow? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, again, coming back to the idea of engaging with work that is centered around like the earth. And I think of layers of soil, and it's a very obvious metaphor or image that your work evokes, but then using it as also a gateway for examining interpersonal relationships, romance, failed romance, heartbreak, all of these really broad spectrum of human emotion. And I love that about your work, but also just about, poetry in general, that tends to start to weave those things in very subtly. And certainly I can find, like elements of, say, like Mary Oliver in your work.
Thank you. What a compliment.
And there's a lot of bridges to that type of poet, that naturalism. I wonder, would you consider your work to fall under the umbrella of eco-poetics at all? Like, or do you feel like, because obviously when you start getting into classification, it can start to pigeonhole people's, work. And I certainly wouldn't want to place limitation on what your work is focused on doing. But at the same time, I feel like there is an engagement with like eco-poetics, and certainly, work that engages with the environment and our relationship to it.
Yeah, I think that if anything, this book definitely falls within that realm, if not directly under it, then, very, very overlapping. Place is really, really important to me. I actually just wrote a draft of a poem where I wrote the line, every poem's in Pennsylvania, even the ones that aren't. I'm from Harrisburg, and I don't know if you can see, but like this is the top of the Susquehanna River that I have tattooed.
Oh, wow.
I really like Pennsylvania. Yeah, I was born in Harrisburg. I went to school in Selinsgrove for undergrad. And so in that sense, the river and that sort of landscape is like always in my mind. It's always influencing what I'm writing. Even if you're looking at, this is more in terms of place than in terms of eco-poetics, but even in that poem I read, I talk about the honesty box, which is something that's like sort of pretty specific to Pennsylvania. I know that they exist in other places too, but it's definitely a cultural phenomenon. Do you know what an honesty box is?
Yeah, I've encountered it. I was living in Northern California because I went and did my undergrad at Sonoma State University, and there's a lot of small family farms and various growers around there. And so honesty boxes were part of, kind of doing like crop swaps, and yeah, it's very much a part of the culture up there, which was a new phenomenon for me at the time, given that I'm from
Yeah.
Southern California and honesty boxes don't really exist here, like at
Yeah.
all. So actually, we do have a small urban farm, like just up the street from us, that I believe they have an honesty box there.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That's like the only one I've seen since, I've existed in Southern California.
Yeah, and I do know that they exist other places, but they really are just everywhere. Pennsylvania is just such a specific state. You can really go from like urban to rural very quickly. And there's a lot of farms and like there's also like something like 600 state parks or something like that.
Hmm.
It's like there's a lot of texture and differences in the landscape. And so when I'm writing my poems, I'm almost always thinking about Pennsylvania in some way. And I'm thinking a lot about that landscape and about how things are growing and how things are moving and how plants and people and mountains and rivers are interacting with each other.
Hmm.
And so I feel like a lot of ecopoetics is really focusing on climate change as it should. So the only reason I hesitate, not because I don't want to be a part of ecopoetics, but the only reason I
Right.
hesitate to fully take on that label is because my poems never really touch on that sort of
Hmm.
change for the most part.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that ecopoetics has been very, very influential to me in thinking about the way that I'm looking at place and looking at landscape in my poetry, and also thinking about plants and how they grow. Which
Hmm.
also, as a side note about brassica, part of the reason I love brassica so much is because the wild Brassica oleracea plant still exists.
Hmm.
It's this sort of scrubby, 2 or 3 foot tall, like it's got little yellow flowers. It's got sort of like
Hmm.
tough leaves. And the reason that we have all of the cultivars is because humans loved the plant so much.
Hmm.
And so I guess that probably is the most eco-poetics thing, is just the whole
Ye-
concept of my book. Which is that like it's so easy to be like, oh, humans are ruining everything, right?
Right.
Or corporations, which are made of humans in the end, like
Yeah.
that's the reason that we have oil spills, and that's the reason that we have smog, and that's the reason that we have we used to get a couple of big snows here in Maryland and Virginia every year, and we haven't gotten one in the past like 2 years, and it's really freaking me out.
Yeah.
But then you have broccoli, and broccoli exists because somebody looked at this plant and said, I'm going to cultivate this so that it really focuses on the flowers and the
Hmm.
stem. Or you have Brussels sprouts, where this is in my poem, the sort of like, I call it my centerfold poem for
Hmm.
brassica, which is about the brassica plant. And I say how, when people say, oh, Brussels sprouts, they're like little cabbages. They're not like little cabbages. They literally are little cabbages. They are the lower like radial buds on a brassica oleracea plant that we've cultivated that way instead of just cultivating the top one into
Wow.
a big cabbage thing. And so, yeah, I just think it's really beautiful. Also, that in terms of the wild domestic, that, humans loved this plant for so long that we created so many different versions of it that we almost forgot. And a lot of people forget. They don't know. They never knew that it all came from the same place.
Yeah. And maybe to your point, you are engaged with ecopoetics, but then at the same time, it's naturalist poetics. It's
Hmm.
there's so many different elements. And I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that there is an urbanism that is also like present in your work. And so all of those elements tend to blend really well together. And again, it's like if I think about metaphor and analogy is it's like layers of the soil is it has
Hmm.
that kind of that feel to it. I wanted to come back to you talk about your love of Pennsylvania, and I too am a big fan of Pennsylvania. My sister lives in Pittsburgh,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so yeah, Pittsburgh and even the surrounding environs, like just going outside the city, I mean, it's amazing. I've often considered, if I were to live anywhere else in the United States, it would be Pittsburgh probably. My wife will never leave Southern
Yeah.
California because 72 degrees and is that's the bottom of
I was
like
going to say, it gets real cloudy in Pittsburgh.
and I'm okay with cold, wet, and everything else and stuff. Obviously, by virtue of my gingerness, I
Mhm.
should be in a cold climate herding sheep somewhere. But you talked about, you pointed out that you have this tattoo, the Susquehanna and
Susquehanna.
Susquehanna.
I don't expect you to
Terribly.
know that, but it is one of those things where, because I also went to the university that bears the same name.
Okay.
And so people
Okay.
will be like, oh, you went to Susquehanna? And I'm like, not.
That's good.
But Pennsylvania is really specific about this too, because we have 5 dialects in
Hmm.
Pennsylvania, which for the area that we have, we should really have 3.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of words like that that are really specific. Like it's not Lancaster, it's Lancaster. It's not Lebanon, it's Lebanon. And
Yeah.
it's also not Lebanon Bologna, it's Lebanon Bologna.
Yes. Yeah. Using rutabagas as an example, you use the page very broadly, and I'm very partial to that. Especially in my first book, I was very broad with how I did line breaks and utilizing a lot of white space to kind of create a map, if you
Mhm.
will. And I love that about your work. I just love that in general, like how people will use the page very broadly to be able
Mhm.
to create maps. And I also liken it to architecture. There's an interesting geography and interesting architecture that's present. I also noticed that you have some work that's more formalistic and
Mhm.
has more formalistic conventions. I'm thinking of some of your poems that use syllabics, rhyme. I just wanted to know, when you're writing and, you're sitting down with the intention of writing, do you find that your decisions to maybe use kind of less conventional line breaks or what have you versus using more formalistic conventions like rhyme scheme syllabics and whatnot, does that come organically for you, pun intended, um, or is it something that do you sit down with an intention going, okay, we're going to utilize more formalistic conventions like in this particular piece?
Yeah, so I always like having some amount of constraint to what I'm writing. But that said, pretty much everything always sort of joke that I'm like a prose writer that is like tricking people into publishing my prose that's very small. Because I really like stories and I really like characters. And the line did not come easy to me.
Hmm.
A lot of what I was thinking about a lot when I was in undergrad and I got a degree in creative writing, I was thinking a lot about like what is the line? And then
Hmm.
in grad school I had to take this MFA exam and I was just looking at my rationale for this the other day. And my questions for that were like what is the line? What is the sentence? What is the difference between a line and a sentence when you're
Hmm.
looking at a poem? It just sort of seemed random to me at first, I guess is my thought. Even when I was looking at poems, unless it was a really structured like a sonnet or something. And so whenever I start drafting, all my poems, I almost always handwrite them. And I
Hmm.
almost always, they're just kind of like prose poems,
Yeah.
is really what they are.
Yeah.
And so it's through revision usually that I find a more specific form. I know with Brassica and with rutabagas, you can see it. My friend Sarah had said to me when I was revising those poems, she was like, I think you need to give these poems more space to breathe. And I know that you're so obsessed with these like botanical drawings. So I don't know if you've ever seen one of those botanical drawings where it's this like sort of beautiful,
Hmm.
thin line work. And then there's the little labels on each side.
Yep.
And so with these poems, I was really thinking, especially the ones that are really about a specific vegetable, I was sort of imagining the poem as sort of the labels around this white space, and the white space itself was where the vegetable would go or the relationship
Mm.
would go, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Which is like not something that totally translates to anybody else necessarily
Yeah,
without me
yeah.
telling them. But yeah, so when I had first written these poems, they were not in that form. And then I really, through revision, was molding them to fit. And then from there, you sort of get a better sense of where to break the line and where sentences that are complete sentences versus fragments work better and with each other. And then for poems like, so in Ashley Sugarnatch and the Wolf, Ashley's poems are all prose poems. And so
Hmm.
there's 2 characters in that book. There's Ashley Sugarnatch, who is a lady, and there's the wolf, who is essentially the big bad wolf.
Hmm.
He is like the wolf of myth, and he is bad, and he is like never gonna redeem himself. And he is not doing well with that. Like he is really trying his best to not murder Ashley. And
Hmm.
he fails because it's a cycle and because they're fated and because it's within the world of a book. And so
Hmm.
people actually said to me in grad school that if I let Ashley die, it was my fault. a
Wow.
dude a dude told me if you let Ashley die, the blood's on your hands. I was like, this is fictional.
Wow.
Like I'm literally talking about metaphor right now. This is an extended
Wow.
metaphor, my dude. But my point being, Ashley's poems were all prose poems, which I did specifically pick that form for her because everything about her life, because she's this sort of woman that's expected to be super hyper feminine, that's expected to live a certain life, everything about her life is so curated and so specific that her prose poems are just sort of all over the place. Like they're very stream of consciousness. The wolf, on the other hand, like I said, is trying really, really hard to keep it together. And so all of his poems are either in a specific form or they're in syllabics. And so the idea there is that he's really trying to constrain himself, like both constrain himself, and it's also a constraint of the work. And so with those poems, I knew that I wanted to write a poem that was a sestina, because I love sestinas. They're also my husband's favorite form. Because as he said, somebody had to invent a sestina, and then someone else had to look at that form and say, yeah, that was a good idea. And then a villanelle too, which I just also like for similar. I really like how when you repeat something, how it changes this on the second time, which I feel like is probably why, comes from me liking music so much. But that said, those poems, I sort of had to be a little bit more intentional, but I also wrote those poems later into the projects, if that makes sense. And I know that for my third book right now that I'm working on, it's called Elision. And it's just a draft. It's like a very embryonic draft right now, but it also is using a lot of white space, very similar to how Brassica is. It's really a hybrid poetry, memoir type situation. But I know now, after having drafted it, that I really need to write sort of a keystone poem, Keystone State, Pennsylvania, that looks at the word elision itself, because elision is the noun form of elide. And of course, eliding in poetry is when you say like o'er the river and through the woods, and you don't have the V so that it fits within the meter. And so I'm really going to, people don't know what that is. And so I feel like I'm really going to need to have a poem that's going to be very specific, very formal, that's looking at the word elision and the history of elision.
When I think back to my own process, although I haven't published any, I tend to fall back to the pantoum, which is...
Oh yeah, pantoums are great.
Yeah, it's like one of my favorite forms, just because the repetition and just the fact that it can go on and on and on and on and on. And then, when that happens, I'm able to fall into a rhythm, and then somehow, some way, that music starts to kind of come out of the writing again. If I feel like I'm getting stuck and I'm getting too much into abstraction, or if I'm feeling like the echo chamber in my head is just kind of going at a 10. One thing that you have written about that I appreciate on a personal level is that you have seasonal affective disorder.
Yeah.
I struggle with generalized anxiety disorder and depression. I, take medication to be able to manage those things. And kind of without sounding too cliche, how does your struggle with seasonal affective disorder strengthen your writing? I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah. So small side note, the essay that I wrote about that was called "In Which My Seasonal Affective Disorder Manifests as Incessant Dreams About Ben Schwartz."
Yes.
I'm seeing him Thursday. He's doing improv at the Anthem in DC, and I have second row tickets. And by tickets, I mean one ticket, because they were very expensive. So it's just for me. I was like, oh, guess my husband's not coming to this one.
Oh, that's amazing.
But yeah, I saw him once already last year, and it was because in the essay I talk a lot about how when my brain really broke in 2021 and I was like really depressed, my brain was like, think about Ben Schwartz, that'll make you feel better. And I didn't think I had really considered him that much before then, but I had just consumed so much media about Ben Schwartz that when I did finally see him last summer, I just was like crying the whole time. And I am a crier, but then like also laughing because it's like an improv comedy show, but then like crying. It was very confusing. But yeah, I think so seasonal affective disorder is very specific, and it's very specific because you know exactly what the cause of it is, and you know exactly how to fix it. And so I know that for me, and I write about this in the essay too, like I almost felt not like I was faking it, but like I had some sort of like less mysterious or meaningful version of depression, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to downplay how debilitating it can be, because it is very debilitating and was for me, especially before I went on medication, which now I just take Zoloft seasonally and it fixed it. Like I'm just at this threshold where it's like, I cannot deal without, very hard for me to deal with it without medication. And with medication, it's just literally gone, which
Yeah.
seems like magic.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things I always think about with this is that it really helps me think about my place of privilege in the world, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it is a very privileged, again, and I'm not, other people have versions of seasonal affective disorder, which is not easily medicated, or they're already on medication for general depression. And so this is just making it worse. And there's not really a way to deal with it the way that I do. But my specific version of SAD really makes me think about my privilege in the world and the way that I interact with it, because I can very easily be put on medication. It doesn't affect other parts of my life, except that it makes me very awake, which is actually sort of useful as compared to being like so tired. It fixes it and it makes it go away. And when I think about people that struggle with depression that is more generalized or it's more severe and there's no way to know when or how it's going to go away, it really makes me appreciate the fact that I do have the resources to be able to go to a doctor, the health insurance to be able to pay essentially nothing for that medication. I think I pay like $10 or something. And I think it is important, especially because like I am white and I am relatively privileged in terms of like the job that I have and the place that I live. And it's really important for me to be able to have both things be true, which is that it is both true that I'm incredibly privileged and I should be very grateful for that. And it is also true that when I am in it with my seasonal affective disorder and with my depression, that is real and that is very difficult. And it is going to make my life very hard to live through. And it's going to make it harder for my partner and for my child because I'm not going to be as present. And so I guess the balancing act between being able to acknowledge that two things that seem maybe counterintuitive to each other can be true at the same time is something that I'm really interested in also in my writing. That's part of the reason why I focused so much time on the wolf and Ashley Sugarnotch and the wolf, even despite the fact that he was bad, like inherently evil. I think that answers your question. I don't want to repeat myself again.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I too have had to consider my own privilege when thinking about like my mental health struggles, being a heteronormative white man, and the fact that I grew up in a fairly wealthy part of Southern California, and I had access to a lot of things that many people don't. And I find that it's interesting that even with having that access, I still managed to struggle for so long. And so it only highlights how much is lost for so many people who will never have that access or have such like limited access, limited resources. And it's painful to think about. And I appreciate that you're cognizant of that. I know that for myself, like when it was the height of the pandemic, my brain shut down. I mean, like I didn't write for the better part of 2 years, and really struggled with trying to dig out of that hole. And I at one point made the disastrous decision to get off of medication, which just like
in the pandemic?
Yeah, during the pandemic, which like
what a choice, sir.
So yeah, I know it was the wrong time to experiment with that decision. So
you're like, I've got time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We'll see how low we can go with this stuff. But I spiraled.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
It was gnarly, and there was a couple of times that like I was on the brink and it was not good, but I managed to come to terms with the fact that I need medication to be able to function. And then I have now found an amazing therapist and who's done wonders. And so it's just the fact that I can look back on that and find a comparison. And then, to your point, think about the fact that if there are people struggling as much or more than I did and they don't have access to those resources, how just fundamentally unfair that is. Obviously, we could have a much larger conversation about healthcare and mental health care in this country, but
I think that thinking about those things are important to me because thinking about those things helps me make choices in the people I support and the community that I'm building. I have a 7-year-old, and I am now part of a school community, which is sort of
Mhm.
incredible. I'm part of this really structured community again. And I really try to make sure when I'm making choices about the way things show up and the way that activities are structured and anything in my community like that, I'm trying to think, okay, how can I speak up to help populations or groups of people, which sometimes are just children, like literally children don't
Mhm.
know, can't necessarily advocate for themselves, so that they can be as nurtured and cared for within this community as possible. And that can, also reflect to the community of writers as well. How can we create a community of writing and of writers and of literature that is supportive of every sort of person and letting every sort of person live the best that they can live.
Absolutely. One thing that I love is that you're also a podcaster,
I am.
and you have a show, and I'd love to hear more about the podcast, but also, does the podcast impact your writing? Do you find that it informs your writing or your writing process?
So I know that, well, first off, the podcast itself, I was thinking about the second question. The podcast is called The Smug Buds, which is to say we're smug and we're friends. And people thought we were rhyming for a really long time. And we're like, no, we're not bugs. We're friends. We're buds. And my friend Will and I both really loved podcasts when we started this. And he and I had sort of like said, well, if I had a podcast, I would do this. And if I had a podcast, I would do this. And he lives in Arizona, so he lives really far away from me, which I hate every day. A lot of my friends are in Arizona and I hate it. I would like them to be here. But finally, I had said something to Will and he had texted me. I can like remember where I was. I was in bed and I had sort of leaned over and picked up my phone. And there was this text message. It was like the morning. And he said, I can't stop thinking about the fact that you said you would start a podcast. Do you want to do it? And I just said, yes. And then from then on, we've been recording and we've gone through iterations of how often we record because it sort of like doesn't matter. Like we don't have
Mhm.
we don't have
Yeah.
sponsors. It's just us. We have such a small listenership. Like I can see how many people listen to each episode. But by the same token, it's like sometimes it's like 50 to 70 people. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, 50 to 70 people that I know are listening to this. Because
Yeah.
it's definitely not people I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's pretty good, I think.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but we talk about things that we're smug about. And the idea was that like one of us would sort of lead an episode and we'd get to talk about something that we just feel very like smug about. The episode that we're recording tomorrow actually is about screen time with children because
Oh.
I won't get too much into this. You can check out the episode of the Smug Buds about this. That'll probably be out when this comes out. But basically like parents freak out about screen time. And I feel like the part of the conversation that isn't being included is that movies are art.
Mhm.
TV is art. And there's obviously like spectrum here of what's useful or interesting, but I think that in and of itself is worth talking about. And I
Mhm.
feel very smug about this and I'm a parent and I'm allowed to feel smug about it. Will talks mostly about media and I talk about media too. But I will say that the thing that has been so useful to my writing about the podcast is actually in writing essays and writing
Mhm.
prose. Again, I love writing prose, but I just sort of was always told I was not particularly good at it for a
Mhm.
while.
Mhm.
And so I was like, well, I guess I'm going to write a poem then. It really was like, oh, the fiction people are being mean to me and the stuff I want to write is weird. So like the poetry people will basically take it. Poetry felt very queer to me. Let me put it that way. I
Mhm.
was like, poetry will take whatever I write. It doesn't matter what the form is. It can be a paragraph and they'll be
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
sounds good. And so in both listening to and actually working on the podcast with Will, I think I really developed my voice for sentences and how to move through an arc of something, not
Mhm.
even necessarily like an argument or a thesis, but just truly like a narrative arc and where we start laying a foundation to something, building to a point, and then having some sort of turn where I sort of, it opens up or reveals itself in a new way that I would like to land on. And so, yeah, I think that's how it's really, really helped my writing the most is just getting me, because I love talking is the other thing. Like you
Mhm.
picked a good person to ask to be on your podcast. I'll talk to you about whatever for any amount of time. And so I think that just having this sort of very consistent thing over, I had mentioned to you before we started recording that I just bought this new computer, and the computer that I had before this, I bought right before we started the podcast. So it's been like 6 or 7 years now. And part of the reason that I was able to do the podcast was because my old computer was really loud. And it was like impossible for me to record without you hearing just like in the background from the motor and the fan.
Uh-huh.
And so, yeah, like we've been doing it for, I think I said to Will, I was like, Will, we've been doing this for like 6 years. And he was like, you don't have to say that. You don't have to bring that up. But yeah, that really, having that really consistent time, whether it be every other week or every month, where Will and I are talking and really consistently moving through different subjects that we just love so much, has been super useful to me in writing my prose.
That's awesome. I'm finding that the interviews that we've been doing have been really informative for my own writing process. And if anything, just even when I'm reading, it helps inform how I process whatever text I'm engaging with, and my relationship to the work and, to the experience. So I can definitely appreciate that. For our playlist, you selected Never Tire by Roof Beams.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know why that song, and does it influence or make its way into your writing at all? Do you, how do you relate to it?
Yeah, so my favorite band ever is Roof Beams, formerly Raise Up Roof Beams. They've been my favorite band since I was 16, and I'm going to be 35 also in 9 days. Elliot and I have the same birthday.
Oh, that's amazing.
It is amazing. I'm also very smug about that. Not everybody's plans work out, but mine sure did. Yeah, it's been almost 20 years, and Roof Beams is like really just Nathan. It's my friend Nathan. His name's Nathan J. Robinson, and he was my local band when I was in Harrisburg, and then he moved to DC, and now I'm in Germantown, Maryland, and he's sort of my local band still.
That's awesome.
But he's just like, I mean, I always talk about him whenever I can. I don't know if he thinks I'm annoying or not, but he's so smart. He like works with trains. Like he has a real job. He like does something with trains. I made him explain it to me once at a show. I was like, I know you do something with trains, but like what? And he was like, well, he explained a train to me, and I was like, yeah. And he was like, yeah, so I like do that. I'm like, you do what? You just explained where a train is in California. But anyway, he's just so smart. And when I was younger and I was like listening to his songs, I would just listen to them like over and over again, and they'd have so many layers of nuance. He was like referencing Dostoevsky. He has a song called Letters to Aloysia, which is about notes from the underground, and it's also about like the brothers Karamazov. And Never Tire it's so funny to me because it's not a new song at all. I think the first time I heard it was 2011, but feels like a new song to me because it's newer than his older songs, if that makes sense still.
Yeah.
But it's this song, and you know what? I actually don't know what it's about, because once I sort of described what it was about to him, and he was like, oh, it's interesting how people interpret things differently. And I was like, what do you think this song's about? But it's the song about, the chorus is, and I think I know how to run and never tire. And for me, it was always the song about being so intimately and intensely in something, whether it's a relationship or a situation or, an event that maybe you can't avoid. And that you are deciding to yourself, I think I know how to do this and not run out of energy. I think I know how to run and never tire. When in reality, we are going to break, right? We can't do everything to the height of our energy at all times.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you're in situations like a couple of years ago, my husband's father had a stroke and hit his head and was in a coma for a month, and then he died after we took him off life support. And we were like driving from here up to Scranton like every weekend. We were taking off time from work, but not nearly as much. We should have just not been working, but capitalism.
Yeah.
And I just remember listening to that song over and over again and thinking to myself, I know that this isn't true, but sometimes you have to think this to yourself.
Mm.
Sometimes you have to think to yourself, I think I know how to run and never tire to get through something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that song is just, it's so lush. It's so intense. It's really driving. And it also has some Kelly, who used to sing with the band, is singing some sort of higher parts in the background too, which I feel like really provide this balance to what's
Mm-hmm.
happening in the song. And yeah, I'm not sure I'll ever find a song I love more than that song. And I love every song that Nathan has ever written. There was one song on his one album that I was like, I don't really like this one. And I don't dislike that song. And I still know all the words to it, but I later learned that his bandmate actually wrote that song. And I wish I could have told you I was just like both relieved. I was like, oh
Yeah.
my God, thank God that I haven't broken the streak. And then the second thing that happened is I immediately felt smug. I was like, you picked it out immediately. You knew that wasn't. You were like, this one's weird. Yeah, it is weird because Nathan didn't write it. And it's a perfectly fine song. There's nothing wrong with the song. I just don't love it as much as I love literally every other thing he's ever written. So yeah, Never Tire. It's my favorite song. And also, one small side note, there's a whole part of that song in the recorded version that's just not there.
Mm-hmm.
After the second verse, he starts singing about cathedral stones and then says, I forget what the line is because it's not recorded anymore, but he says, into that fire, and I think I know how to run and never tire. And at one point he plays it live and he played it with that part. I was like, Nathan, I thought you'd cut that out. I was like so sad about it. And he was like, no, we just forgot to record it. I was like, you what? You forgot to what? So yeah, it's a little bit of lore for the song too.
Nice. Are there any projects that you are currently working on that you'd like to promote, publications, any events that are coming up?
Oh man, I wish I had an event coming up. If you would like to see me walk out of the anthem on Thursday weeping, you can find me there. After seeing Ben Schwartz, when I saw him last year in the summer, I had made a little chapbook of it just in case I saw him. And this was before it was published, but I was like, just in case I see him, I'll just be like, here you go. Because I would like to thank him. I want to say to him, I've practiced this. I want to say to him, I know I don't know you, but I love your work. And I think it means something that when my brain stopped working, it picked your work to save it. Yeah. And for that, I want to say thank you. Yeah. Also, here's an essay I wrote that I think you'll think is maybe a little funny. And I was in the middle of, this is a whole other thing, but I had TMJ that summer in a way that was like pretty debilitating. I was really sick and I didn't I had fatigue. There was I spiked a fever. I threw up for 3 months. I was really sick. And so this was in the middle of that. And we hadn't figured it out yet and put me on muscle relaxers. And so I got out of the theater and I thought, I guess I could hang around and see if he comes out, but I should probably just be responsible and metro home. And then a woman that sat behind me that I had talked to at this stupid improv show sends me a picture on Instagram. She met him. If I had just hovered for 10 minutes, if I had just hovered like a creep, I would have been able to hand him the tiny chapbook. But does he know it exists? I don't think so. And if he does, then I don't know, maybe he hates it because he's never told me about it.
I'm all for earnest displays of enthusiasm, especially for other people's art. And I am guilty of sending my copies of my books randomly to people whose art I love. And I've never gotten a response. And I've had plenty of times where I'm driving home and all of a sudden this feeling of shame and terror kind of rises up in me because I'm just like, why did I do that?
Yeah. Do you know the band Me Without You?
I think I've heard of them.
So Me Without You, they don't play anymore, but they just finished last year. I really owe a debt to them in Ashley Sugarnash and the Wolf. I have a line that I sort of took from them. He has the line, I never would have laid in this grave of a body for so long. And that shows up in my poem. And then there's my favorite poem. My favorite poem in Ashley Sugarnash and the Wolf is probably The Wolf, A Shadow Manifested, which owes a huge debt to the Me Without You song, Wolf Am I, parentheses, and Shadow. And so I think Aaron Weiss in the book, and I tried to get him to blurb the book. and he never blurbed it, but I got an email like 7 months later. I mean, I love this band. Aaron Weiss
Yeah.
is a weird guy. He's like
Yeah.
the weirdest little dude. And he sent me like the weirdest little email that was like, hey, I know you asked me to blurb this. Sorry, I didn't. It's probably for the best. I think blurbs are bad. Just like, hey man, I'll take whatever I can get. But at his show, they were touring Brother Sister, which was their one album, and they were playing it through. I like went to the guy at the merch table at the end and I was like, can you please give this to Aaron Weiss? I'm so sorry to be weird. I signed it to him and I
Yeah.
had tabbed important poems and I
Yeah.
was like, it's a real book. And he just went, yeah. And like threw it in this like tip box. And I was like, I don't know if Aaron Weiss is ever What is this life if not to tell people we love them? I didn't actually answer your question, but I think the short answer is that I had a lot of stuff published at the beginning of the year. And I think that I'm like done of all of those things. And now I'm trying to just like get Brassica actually published. And I would be terrible to not mention that the book includes illustrations by my friend Aram Han. And I wanted them because again, it was like so important to me, this like thought of like this botanical drawing. And so she did these gorgeous illustrations for me. She did one of an artichoke. My favorite one is of the Brussels sprouts because I talk about them looking like marbles. And so some of the Brussels sprouts she did as marbles, but you can't, like, you don't notice when you first look at it. You sort of are looking at it and then they reveal themselves to you, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm trying to get that published. I'm trying to get a short story published about improv and kissing. Thanks, Ben Schwartz. And I'm starting to work really seriously on this third book and on an essay called Love Me. But I think more people are going to have to die before the third book comes out. And we'll see if I ever get that Love Me essay right. I've been writing it for like 5 years now.
I should note that our managing editor, Heather Watson, is a huge Ben Schwartz fan as well.
Oh.
I also love Ben Schwartz, but she has a deep appreciation for Ben Schwartz.
Oh, I'm so glad I'm not the only. I mean, I know I'm not the only one. He's like selling out all of his improv shows. It's funny how, you know, he can be so popular. And so, you know, he's the voice of Sonic the Hedgehog and also my dreams at night. I still dream about him regularly, by the way. I still dream about him once or twice a month, if not more often than that. But it is amazing how sometimes I'll be at work and I'll be like, oh yeah, do you know who Ben Schwartz is? And they'll be like, no. And I'm like, have you ever watched Parks and Rec? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, do you know Jean-Ralphio Saperstein? They're like, no. And it's just
Where can folks find you online?
You can find me at exclamate on Instagram and at exclamate_ on Twitter, which I will dead name because it's not real, not a real human. And you can find me at exclamate on some of the other social media things now that I've been trying to just sort of hold a place in case other things collapse, and we'll see what happens. And you can always find me at Elizabeth Deanna Morris Lakes. My name is Alina Vanbic Pentameter. I don't know if you knew that.
Yes.
But you can find me at my website, and then you can also find the Smugbuds at smugbuds.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been wonderful.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much for asking such careful and thoughtful questions.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. All right, Lennart Lundh, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. We're so glad to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. I wanted to start off talking about your process with your photos. So the photos that we chose for our issue, I loved the different scenes that were set up. You have this wonderful photo, and for our listeners, you can go check this out. I believe it was in issue 3. Yeah, issue 3. And the photos that we selected, I love the texture that is in the, that first photograph with all those different bottle tops. And then you move to the next photo and there's this wonderful juxtaposition or contrast, I should say, between the shadow and the light that's coming through these slats. And it creates this wonderful abstract design. And then the last photo of the empty chair next to the payphone has this wonderful, almost absurd quality to it. It's a surreal, and there's kind of a surrealism that's present in terms of the absence of a body and the sense of waiting. And I love how the photos together, they tell a story almost, and in terms of jumping from something that's almost micro in nature with these bottle tops to kind of almost like stretching out into something more macro. There's both something quotidian and familiar, but then also kind of surreal. And, I spoke to the poet Jose Hernandez Diaz, and we were talking about kind of like the surreal and the absurd and the everyday. And I just wanted to get an idea, can you kind of talk about your process when shooting photos? Do you go in with a specific idea in mind with your subject matter, or is there some other jumping off point for you?
I don't go in with a specific subject matter in mind, not anything concretely in my mind. In addition to being a quote unquote fine art photographer, which I'm not sure I am, I think I'm something a little different than that, but I'm also a documentary photographer.
Mhm.
I am a poet. I'm a historian by degree and by writing, and I'm a short fictionist. And all of these things feed each other on found inspirations.
Mm-hmm.
So that very first shot with the soap container bottles, I was in an IKEA here in the Chicago area. The shadows are on the side of our microwave cabinet in the kitchen.
Mm.
The one I call Time Portal, because you've got this telephone and an old wrought iron chair, was outside of a store where we used to go shopping before they closed. And that's what I find. I've done a lot of shooting in Michigan City, Indiana, walking the back streets. No idea what I'm going to find, and I'm not looking for anything particular. I do have a penchant for windows and doors, but I don't go looking for them specifically. I find them. I just did a one-man show at the Orland Park Library here, just outside Chicago, and the title was Found Still Life, which is a photographic class, and that's exactly what it was. I walked into a room, and there was a still life there that needed photographing, even though nobody had intended it. The kind of photography I showed you and the kind of photography that goes up on the gallery walls, no, there's no intention. The documentary side, I've got probably at least 10,000 images in military museums in the United States, in fire historian collections and archives. And in that case, yeah, when I go out with the camera, I am looking for specifics. I go to a museum and I'm looking for the aircraft and vehicles they have on display. And anything else is secondary. I drop my wife off at bingo on a Thursday night, and I drive by the fire training center for a nearby town. And I've got my camera with me because if there's a fire vehicle there, I want to photograph.
Right.
So there's two types of photography that I do, and there's two different mindsets involved.
Do you feel like the two speak to each other in a way? For example, like if you're going out for documentary purposes and you have that intention behind your subject matter for those photos versus when you're doing, I guess, as you said, like fine art photography, it's more freewheeling. Do you think that those two intentions kind of speak to each other, or is it or is it just kind of different mindsets that are almost, isolated?
I don't really think they're isolated, although I very easily slip into one of those two mindsets and focus there while I'm in the moment. But no, the three disciplines that I write in, the three genres I write in, and the two types of photography that I'm fondest of, they all inform the others in one way or another. I mean, being a poet, you've got to deal with rhythm, you've got to deal with balance. Writing fiction demands potential. History insists on details, and any kind of photography needs all three of those. Oh, there's a constant conversation going on. Yeah,
definitely. Do you feel like shooting, for example, in black and white versus shooting in color, do you have a preference? And do you feel as though one I guess one mode might lend itself more to your photography than the other?
Nowadays, I always go out with a DSLR,
Mm-hmm.
and it's always in color mode.
Mm.
And even if when I'm photographing something, I'm saying to myself, that's going to be black and white, the original image is color. It's a matter of simplicity. Because I'm going to shoot myself if I photograph it in black and white and find out it would have looked better in color. You know,
Yeah.
you can't undo that transition.
Yeah.
Back before the DSLR, a lot of the documentary work that I photographed was black and white
Mm-hmm.
because the film was cheapest.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I started doing that stuff in 1965 when I was 17.
Mm.
Okay, so cheap was important.
Yeah.
Processing costs were important. I just came back from a week in San Diego with my wife, went back home for a vacation, and got my trusty DSLR with me and ran over 1,000 frames in 7 days.
Oh, wow.
I could not, these days, retired on Social Security, burn that kind of film.
Yeah.
You know, the change in technology has allowed me to simplify by just shooting color and then deciding what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it has simplified by allowing me to take chances with what I photograph and how I photograph.
Mm-hmm.
Because I can afford to make mistakes
Mm-hmm.
in the effort to catch one of those minor miracles.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I had an ex-girlfriend who, at the time, I was shooting just in black and white, and this was on a DSLR, and she was the one that told me, she's like, no, you really need to shoot in color because it's going to give you so much more flexibility in terms of finding which mode is going to work best with whatever the subject is that you're shooting. And she was absolutely right. That's been my default sense. I had mentioned kind of at the start of our interview, you know, I noted like the surrealist and absurdist tones in your work, and I think that that can be present in some architecture and finding juxtaposition. I was wondering, do you have certain subjects that you prefer shooting over others? For example, objects versus architecture?
Yeah, well, I'm very introverted, so I'm not comfortable photographing people for a number of reasons. I'm a street photographer, but I'm not. I
Mm-hmm.
don't photograph people on the street.
Mm-hmm.
I do go into the old part of Lamont, Illinois,
Mm-hmm.
up on the hillsides above the oil refinery, and I photograph everything in sight except people. That's still street photography,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of people would argue that.
Yeah.
Just like people argue that photography is not art.
Mm.
You know, go figure. The 3 pictures I sent you all started out as color.
Mm.
One reason that I sent you those was because very few people are using color interiors.
Mm.
It's expensive for the journals. It's expensive for the e-zines. It's expensive for the books. And those 3 lent themselves very well to being monochromatic.
And we have that aesthetic in our journal in terms of we're monochromatic in our layout. Part of that is because we want to maintain a simple layout in order to showcase the work of either the writers or the visual artists or photographers that we're working with. And I love noir photography and just the aesthetic of film noir in general. And so there are things that are present, for example, that kitchen photograph, that have a noir quality to them. I could imagine someone being out of frame smoking a cigarette, you know, and a private detective or something in the background. In that same way, I feel like the work of William Eggleston, which is, you know, vibrant color photographs, but he also does a lot of kind of mundane, like his photography has mundane subjects, but he makes them kind of pop. And your comment about the, you know, the processing fees, because I think he's talked about that before, that, you know, working with printers, it can be very expensive to print all of those very vibrant colors and really get them out there. In that vein, who would you consider to be influences on your work as a photographer? And I do want to pivot to writing in a moment, but I would love to hear if it either is other photographers, visual artists, or even writers, historians, folks that, might be working in other mediums who have influenced your work?
Okay, for photography, I'm a very early member of the boomer generation. I was born in 48, 3 years almost to the day after the second A-bomb was dropped.
Oh, wow.
And I grew up with the combat photographers and Edward Steichen's work with the Navy during World War II and things like that, which brought me into contact with not only later photographers, but photographers working in color, as far as being exposed to them. Anyone in particular? No. No. I'll tell you my earliest recollection as a would-be photographer. I was in 7th grade, so we're talking 1960, 1961. And Scholastic Books, if you remember them.
I do.
For me, history was running a student photo contest. And I just happened to be looking out the window of a house where we were visiting some of my folks' old friends from the old country. And there was a street lamp and there was a tree, and it was about 9 o'clock with the sunset. And I said, I need to get a camera.
Yeah.
So even before I was consciously aware of all of the photographers who work just amazes me, there was something up here that was burning that said, hey, this is one aspect of creativity that sooner or later you're going to have to tap. But yeah, Robert Capra, Dickie Chappelle, the Vietnam photographers, the Toisneaus, the French street photographers who did more than photograph streets or just people. And most of that background is really black and white.
Yeah.
Color film was kind of an expensive rarity when I first laid hands on a camera.
Yeah, and I think of also Vivian Mayer and her work, which largely went undiscovered for decades. And and there's a lot of speculation about whether that archive was ever intended for public consumption. But as a consumer of photography and as a fan of that type of street photography, I mean, I'm glad that it was released into the world, because her eye and her penchant for just snapping photos at the right moment. I mean, it was almost a preternatural ability to read situations, and she just shot so beautifully. So
I've heard people complain that her photography of young children probably should never have been published in a lot of cases. I'm a 75-year-old great-grandfather, okay? I do not see anything really problematic in those images. They are not demeaning anybody. They are not sexualizing anybody. None of the things that are verboten with kids are in those images. She is capturing kids being, quite frankly, kids in the moment, at just the right moment. Whether that's her daughter with a cigarette in her fingers with the whitish dress or not, I don't know. But it's definitely not a kid who should be smoking. But I never should have been either. So,
I wanted to kind of switch gears because, as you had mentioned, you are also a poet, a historian. You write in multiple genres. And I'm curious about how your work as a photographer and then your work as a writer, how the two intersect, how they talk to one another. How are these mediums in conversation? And one of the things that I think of when you have someone who has an eye like you do you ever find that you use your photographs for, ekphrastic purposes in your writing?
It's interesting. I've been asked that question in the last 4 interviews I've done over the course of this year. And the answer to that last part of the question is I have never written a poem based on one of my photographs. I write a lot of ekphrastic poetry. 3 of my 29 collections are nothing but ekphrastic poetry. And some of them are paintings, some are photographs, some are films. So my poetry and my short fiction are certainly influenced by visual art.
Mhm.
My work as a historian, I worked primarily as a writer of aviation history and in support of writers on military subjects and, as I mentioned, fire department subjects, equipment, and so on. So there's a conversation there. Photography requires the three things that my types of writing require, as I mentioned earlier: rhythm and balance, recognizing potential moments. Although the older I get, the harder it is to catch the moments in time. I'm a little slower.
Mhm.
And seeing details within the broader strokes.
Mhm.
Okay. That goes into the photography. And when I'm writing in one of those genres, I'm carrying the photographs with me that I have taken that tapped into those sources too.
Mhm.
My wife wants me desperately to publish books of ekphrastic poetry based on my photography.
Mhm.
Maybe I will. It's not a bad idea.
Mhm.
It's not going to be a self-published project because that would
Right.
be a leg. And I am honestly not well enough known that I think a major publisher would, right now at least, say, "Oh yeah, sure, we'll throw a lot of money into publishing a book of photographs and poetry." I think I've got a lot of years left, and I think that may very well be a path to take. But so far, no, it's
Mhm.
not cost effective.
There's a poet, photographer, and publisher, Joshua Edwards, who I don't know if you're familiar with the Press Canarium, but he does a lot of documentary photography, and he has this wonderful book of a journey where he walked, I believe, from Galveston, Texas, or to Galveston from like Marfa, because he and his wife,
Okay.
Lindh, who is also a phenomenal poet, they live in Texas part of the year, and then in New York another part of the year. But he's originally from there, and so he has these landscape photos and stuff that he did, and some of it is writing and includes his poetry. And there's almost like a Haibun kind of quality to it, and I feel like that's one of those forms these days that doesn't get utilized as much, but in some ways lends itself well to photography and to poetry as a in terms of the intersection of the two.
I think, quite frankly, that those forms, be they in photography or in poetry or both, are starting to make a comeback. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
we could argue all day about the merits of westernized haiku and senryu, but there are a lot of people playing with it and learning from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And writing some very good stuff, even though
Mm-hmm.
it is obviously westernized rather than traditional.
Mm-hmm.
I have a friend in Australia who is a well-known haikuist, and he readily admits that he struggles every time he tries to do a traditional Japanese form as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the westernized versions.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole different mindset.
Mm-hmm.
But I know people who have, some of them my age because they want to do something different. Some of them younger folks who have looked around and said, well, I'm really not big into sonnets and pantoums, but wow, Haibun looks interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they're not dead yet. I think they're making their way back.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because since there is a penchant for hybrid work these days, and so many people want to work across different mediums. If I think about it, Haibun is almost like an original hybrid genre in the sense,
Yeah.
I mean, you have the combination of the haiku with the travel log, and reading Basho's Haibun is fascinating, and it's lovely and often really funny. They all had an incredible sense of humor,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I think is something that can be kind of lacking in a lot of work. And I don't get me wrong, I am not good at humor in my own writing, but I say that because I think back to that first photograph that we were talking about, the soap containers. I can find humor in that photograph that you've shown me and stuff. At the same time, there's a sadness to it. There's the monotony of like these things. Then there's the abstraction of this almost scales. That's one of the things I love about photography and poetry is the fact that you can layer so many of those things together. I wanted to talk about how your work as a poet and a photographer, how that's been informed by your experience as a veteran. I say that because we interviewed Richard Hayden, who is also a photographer, who is also a veteran, and his work as a veteran advocate and does inform his essay writing and also inform some of his work as a photographer. And so I would be curious to find out your thoughts on that as well.
My war poetry in particular, and war is probably one of my three overarching themes in my poetry. My war poetry tends to be very imagery driven, more than other poetry. It's almost intentionally trying to make a snapshot in words out of an event. I'm not only a Vietnam vet, I am one of the few people that I know of who applied for and received a military honorable discharge as a conscientious objector after serving in Vietnam. And that half of my being a veteran also colors my writing. Okay. Because my war poems are not dulciet decorum est and in Flanders fields the poppies grow, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing lyrical or comforting or anything like that about them. They tend to be very raw, as do my nightmares, and very image laden. Intentionally making a picture of that dead kid on the flight deck, or the mad minute. And if you're familiar with what a mad minute is, in Vietnam, it was a point right after sunset where troops would fire off every weapon they had in every direction they had, in the hopes of scaring somebody away from them overnight. And it lasted about a minute, and it was called a mad minute. Well, at sea, even 10 miles off the coast of Vietnam, near Da Nang, we could hear that. That sound traveled. So that has to be converted into an image shaped in words so that people can understand the concept of hearing something from 10 miles away. The concept of being able to tell who was doing the shooting from 10 miles away. All those things, you have to set the mind up to see it as well as to hear it on the page.
Yeah. Having read some of the war poems that you've written, I mean, the ferocity, the rawness, as you indicated, the charge, the physicality, the depth of those things, I think you're very effective at being able to bring that all into immediacy. I think that's one of the great things about poetry is the ability to be able to bring the reader into the moment and that sense of spontaneity, and so it doesn't feel like you're looking at something historical, but you're bringing someone into the presence of a moment that is ultimately very devastating.
Yes. One of my poems, Phrastic Prose Poems, is in two parts. It involves a photograph from 1967 of a young girl in Washington stuffing a flower into the barrel of a young National Guardsman's rifle. And the second half is that famous / infamous shot of the chief of police of Saigon summarily executing the man standing next to him with a 38 caliber short barrel pistol. And you have to be serious writing stuff about that. But at the same time, where I was really going was, that's fine that there's a photograph from 1967 and from 1968, but the poems have to be able to stand 100 years from now without the photograph necessarily available. So they cannot be so specifically place driven. Sandberg made me a poet. Okay, as a sophomore in high school. But I think in some ways, one of his worst poems, legacy-wise, is Chicago, because it is so space or place and time specific that it is really difficult for somebody who didn't live close to the Chicago stockyards, for example, which really no longer exist as the stockyards. My great-granddaughter, 11 years old, would have no idea what he's writing about. And so, yeah, I'm writing about place, I'm writing about specific incident, but I'm writing to spark a conversation in violation of the laws of physics. First, I'm writing to somebody who will probably never hear my voice, who I probably will never see even across an airport, and who may not be born yet. You know, poetry, serious poetry, is time travel.
I like that.
You said something earlier about funny poetry, humor in poetry. The first thing that flashed through my mind when you were talking about that was that there's a big difference between funny poetry and poetry that is so deadly serious that it reeks. I am not one to badmouth any poet that I have ever heard, except maybe to my wife. You know, but then that's a private conversation. Whether I love their poetry or hate their poetry, I respect the choices they make. But I had a mentor, one of my two mentors, as a writer, freshman year of college, Italian literature prof, looked at my poetry and said, "Nobody gives a damn about your teenage angst. But if you translate it into their angst,
right,
it's going to be fine."
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people write poetry as catharsis, and I completely understand that. I totally understand the need to get the demons out of your head and onto the page. But there's a meeting place between that deadly seriousness and a limerick, if you will.
You know,
when I worked at Lewis University, one of the profs would come into my office regularly and just drop a limerick on me, walk out the door, and then come right back in and expect me to have one ready for him. So yeah, limericks are they're fragile. They're fragile. They're good. They're fragile. Yeah.
A well-timed limerick can be a great additive to conversation.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the song that you selected for our playlist, American Tune, by Paul Simon. I just wanted to ask, one, why you chose that song, and whether or not it has any influence on your work as a photographer and a poet, or if it provides some form of inspiration for you.
It is a beautiful translation of St. Matthew's Passion into lyrics, into modern song, and that grabbed me. The concept of being a stranger, voyaging to a new land, grabbed me, because I've felt like that many times.
It's a timeless song, and we've been trying to do with our playlist is that, you know, as we've talked about in our conversation, you have all these different mediums that often intersect, and I feel like music plays such an important role in so many people's lives. And and Paul Simon is one of those songwriters who transcends mediums because his writing is often so poetic. And I think even back to Simon and Garfunkel when Darkness, My Old Friend, and Bridge Over Troubled Water, and I mean, just such beautiful songs. So.
Does that particular song influence my work? That kind of particular song does. And the sentiments expressed in, let's just settle for that song with all of the longing and change and loneliness that is wrapped up into it so quickly in such a tight package. Those are the overarching themes of my poetry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, writing a love poem is not necessarily writing a poem about love, but of non-love.
Mm-hmm.
A war poem is not necessarily saying good things about war or even bad things about war, but just simply sometimes observing. And that's what that song does, that kind of song does. I was blessed to have an uncle 9 years older than me who was into folk music.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I was introduced to folk concerts at the old Chicago area Crown Theater when I was in like 7th grade. Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Baez, and Dylan, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, he was older enough than me that I also got exposed to Lenny Bruce,
Mm-hmm.
The off-color comedians and the Stan Frebergs and so on of the world too.
Yeah.
So what he did for me was he opened doors. Whether my father approved of them or not was a whole different question.
Yeah.
So my roots are in that kind of music.
Mm-hmm.
As a sophomore in high school, one of the things I did was I read a collection of Alan Lomax's copyings of Appalachian folk songs in the original dialect. So that Tom Dooley was stabbed with a knife, not stabbed. So yeah, maybe it's a cop-out, but I think if you're a creative, that everything influences what you do, whether you recognize it or not. If you're creative enough to work in multiple genres, as I am lucky enough to be, I think it's even more true. Because they feed each other. The things that feed my poetry are going to feed my photography, maybe infinitesimally, maybe large scale. I never know. And as I said, when you asked me what's your favorite song, I said, that's for today. After we're done here, I'm going to go in the computer room and throw on my iTunes and probably listen to some Minnie Riperton or something, or the Averill Brothers, whatever. It's all grist for the mill.
Yeah, and I completely relate to that because I'll go back and forth. One day it'll be John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Wayne Shorter, and then, the next day it's some garage rock band from Detroit, or maybe some cumbia or something, something totally different. So they all feed into each other. Absolutely.
And there is so much of it to feed off of too. It's amazing.
Can you talk about any projects that you're currently at work on, and if there are, any publications or events that you wanted to promote?
Well, I have an annual project as a poet that actually might even contain some of my best work, although it's the result of National Poetry Month, the 30-30 concept. I produce a chapbook of poetry every April on my own, of my poetry, and people make donations to St. Baldrick's Foundation, the cancer people, in exchange for getting those poems daily and getting the book at the end of the month. This is last year.
Oh yeah, no, it's beautiful.
I do the covers, I do the backs, I do all the layout design and everything. I never see any of the money that gets donated for the charity. It goes directly to St. Baldrick's, which is the second largest funder, aside from the U.S. government, of children's cancer research in the world.
Oh, wow.
Being a father of 3 and a grandfather of 6 and so on down the line, that is my poetry project. If I do nothing else with poetry in the course of a year, that is on the calendar. Been for the last 10 years. As a photographer, I'm proud of it without being fat-headed about it. I was raised to be kind to others, whether you want to be or not, whether it's convenient or not, whether you know them or not. My wife and I and our oldest daughter are all 3 cancer survivors. I mean, what a better way to be kind,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
As a photographer, my number one project is to get all of those images from the last 6 years that I've had the DSLR organized and straightened out and up on my website.
Mm-hmm.
I've got like maybe 200 images on my website right now out of thousands that I have shot in the last 6-7 years.
Yeah.
I really need to spend time doing that. I am hoping for a mixed creative residency in Hong Kong in February,
Oh, wow.
both as a poet and as a photographer. There's a 30-day all expenses paid residency for up to, I think they take up to 10 submissions every year. And that is a project that I would really love to take on. I've been to Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong as a 20-year-old American sailor. And to look at the pictures from then and the pictures from now, and to read the stories from then and the stories from now, that is just a feeding ground for creative. My other fantasy project is I would really like to get myself a touring bike. And at 75 years old, I'm crazy to even think of it, but take Route 45 from where it starts up in Wisconsin down to Memphis, not Memphis, but Mobile, where it ends.
Oh, wow.
With a camera and a laptop.
Yeah.
You know, just me. Anybody wants to join me for part of the trip, that's cool. But that's my dream. It's just go out and find what's there.
There's a poet, Matthias Svalina. He just rides his bike around the country, and he goes to different cities, and he has this thing called the Dream Delivery Service. And what he does is for 30 days, he'll stay in one city, and then whoever signs up, he'll write you poems and then bike them to your house and deliver them to you. And a lot of these poems end up in different publications, but I have a pamphlet of them when he was visiting from San Diego when I was still living there, and they're wonderful. And
cool.
He's a great poet, wonderful guy too.
My version right now of that project is after I drop my wife off on Thursdays and Fridays at bingo, I head out into the farm country southwest of Chicago in the car, and I go up and down the roads looking to see what's there. That's the lazy man's way of biking to Mobile.
Yeah. Last but not least, where can folks find you online?
My email address is lenlundh@aol.com. I have a bookstore on Etsy. Somebody can go to Etsy and just search my name and find that. I also have a website spun off of Fine Art America. It's very simple, lennart-lundh.pixels.com.
Wonderful.
Lennart is with 2 N's and a T at the end, and Lundh has a silent H at the end. If you come even close to it, you'll find it. I always love hearing from people. I am very free with my email address because I can always block people if it gets out of hand. You know,
it's a wonderful quality. It's something we're hoping to embody with our journal, is to help facilitate community, and regardless of distance. And I definitely appreciate the generosity that you have.
You gotta be.
I agree.
I know that there are poetry circles here and there in the country where people fight with each other constantly. Chicago does not do that. There are people who hate each other privately, and they do it often, but there are no feuds. Everybody tells everybody else what's going on and respects everybody else. That is how I was raised as a child, and that poetry circle that I was introduced to as an adult poet when I finally got into reading my poetry out loud. So yeah, it comes natural. You've got to be generous. You've got to be community. None of us are getting paid shit, so you know we at least got to take care of each other.
Yeah,
we at least got to take care of each other.
Absolutely.
And, I appreciate this opportunity. I really do.
Well, Len, thank you so much for joining us today, and I really appreciate it. And thank you for your work. And we'll be looking for more of your work in the future. And
Oh, you'll see it.
Yep. All right. Well, have a great day, and thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you to Elizabeth Deanna Morris Lakes and Lennart Lundh for joining us on this episode. If you like the podcast, please like and subscribe. And if you're really enjoying it, by all means, leave us a review.
And just a reminder that we do accept submissions to the journal year-round at brokenlensjournal.com, so please submit there.
Thanks to our producer, Destiny. Our theme music is composed and recorded by Art Santora. I'm Adam.
And I'm Heather.
Talk to you next time.
Bye.